Welcome to the Whitmercast, a podcast by the John Whitmer Historical Association. We bring you essays, interviews, panel discussions, and broadcasts related to Mormon history and restoration studies. My name is Katherine Pollock, and I'm currently a master's student in religious studies at Missouri State University, and I'll be your host for today's episode. Thank you for tuning in. We have a great episode lined up for you. We'll be talking with Stephen Smoot and Ryan Passantino. If you'd like to join JWHA or visit our entire backlog of episodes and JWHA journals, go to jwha.info. With that out of the way, let's get started. Today I have the pleasure of being joined by Stephen Smoot and Brian Passantino. Together they edited the book Joseph Smith's Uncanonized Revelations, which came out in 2024. Stephen Smoot currently serves as an adjunct instructor of ancient scripture at Brigham Young University and as a research associate with the Ancient American Foundation. He is a doctoral candidate in Semitic and Egyptian languages and literature at the Catholic University of America. He also holds a master's degree in Near and Middle Eastern civilizations with a concentration in Egyptology. Brian Passantino is a research consultant at the Church History Library. He is also a PhD candidate in history at the University of Utah. Brian received his MA degree from Utah State University, where he wrote an award-winning thesis on Orson Pratt and the expansion of the Doctrine and Covenants. Steve and Brian, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having us, Catherine.
Yeah, we're excited to be here.
How did this all get started? What led you guys on the path to want to put together about Joseph Smith's Uncanonized Revelations?
I think it was mostly an accident. Brian can kind of fill in some of the details, I'm sure, but essentially what happened was we both were independently putting together our own sort of list of uncanonized revelations from Joseph Smith for our own independent private use for our own research. And we happened to be talking about it together one day at, I think it was down at the Church History Library. Brian, right? I was visiting someday. Maybe it was at an old MHA conference. I can't quite remember, but we were just chatting about different research interests. And we happened to mention, hey, look, we're both putting together a list of Joseph Smith's uncanonized revelations. What do you know? And that kind of led to us scheming about, it'd be really useful if there was a book out there with this stuff in there, right? And then that led to us deciding, let's do the book. And so it kind of just went from individually doing our own research to we wanted to sort of Captain Planet by our powers combined. We can make this into a resource, hopefully, that would be of use for other people and other researchers. So from my recollection, that's kind of how this all started. I wonder if Brian has any details he can fill in.
No, that's right. I think it was at the MHA conference in Logan, Utah, when we first discussed this and kind of talked about how we had been compiling our own lists. Mine had to do with my master's thesis on Orson Pratt expanding the Doctrine and Covenants for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints in the 1870s. And as part of that, I wanted to compile the revelations to see kind of what source material he was drawing from to possibly include in his new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. And so we had that conversation and we kind of looked at what was out there and thought that people could benefit from the really great research of the Joseph Smith papers and just the more recent research. And we could compile a list that could be a ready reference for lots of people to access those. So that's how we got started, and it was a great partnership.
Now, what criteria did you use for considering one of Joseph Smith's writings, a revelation?
Yeah, good question. Brian, do you want to take that? And then I can fill in on anything else.
Sure. One of the major criteria we use is we looked at the Joseph Smith papers to see first how they interpreted it and how they understood what a revelation was. And it was more of a kind of a narrow definition. So we didn't want to include some of the revelatory things that he did, with scriptures, that were contained in the Pearl of Great Price, but we wanted to have a criteria that was stricter, where it was more obvious, thus saith the Lord kind of thing. And where it was very apparent that he was using the language of deity to reveal something, usually a divine directive. And so we looked at how the Joseph Smith papers used it. We tried to keep it as narrowly focused as possible because there's obviously lots of teachings of Joseph Smith out there that you could say these are revelatory, these are prophetic, or different things like that. But when we think of a revelation, we thought of a short divine directive. Well, it doesn't have to be short, but a divine directive that is more easily identifiable as using the language of deity to carry it out.
Yeah, in our introduction to our book, we outline four major sort of criteria for how we identify something as a Joseph Smith revelation, just to build on what Brian was saying. So first, sort of the most obvious is, was it ever once part of the Latter-day Saint canon? In this case, for our purposes, the canon of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints based in Salt Lake City, Utah. So if obviously, as Brian can tell you all about it, the history of the canon has changed over time, both in the Latter-day Saint and in the RLDS, or Community of Christ traditions, and in other restoration traditions. So we're focusing on specifically the Latter-day Saint canon from Salt Lake City. Things like the lectures on faith were once a part of the canon, but they're no longer part of the Latter-day Saint canon. Those we consider sort of a separate thing, so they're not included in our book. So that's the first criteria. Was it ever in the canon of Scripture for Latter-day Saints? Second, we are focusing on what we can tell certainly or fairly certainly are Joseph Smith documents. So there's this phenomenon of attributing statements or documents to Joseph Smith that may or may not actually be from Joseph Smith. Their provenance is questionable, or their Joseph Smith authorship is questionable, right? Or there's some question about it. The documents that we selected, we feel confident, along with the broad consensus of scholarship, that these are Joseph Smith documents. So that was our second criteria. And those are the two sort of most obvious, right? It's uncanonized and it's from Joseph Smith, go figure. The third, as Brian said, we are limiting ourselves to either prophetic or revelatory declarations that are either like clear first person declarations in the voice of deity, or close sort of paraphrases or close quotations of the language of deity, right? So we're not including, for example, council minutes where Joseph Smith may have gotten up and taught something to a council or a priesthood leadership. Certainly those teachings may be valuable and they may be useful, but we don't quite count them as revelatory in the sense of like what you find in the Doctrine and Covenants, for example. And then finally, also, as Brian said, we have limited ourselves. We can't include, for example, Joseph Smith's Bible translation or Bible revision, what the Latter-day Saints call the JST, the Joseph Smith translation, or what the RLDS, or Community of Christ, has called the inspired version of the Bible. That would just be too unwieldy to include that as its own sort of thing. That's, again, sort of a separate project. So those are the main criteria. Is it from Joseph Smith? Has it ever been in the Latter-day Saint canon? Is it a verbatim or close approximation voice of deity giving a prophetic declaration? And is it sort of a call like a D&C like revelation, and not something else like his Bible translation or the Pearl Great Price or something like that?
Now, were these easy to find in the Joseph Smith papers, or did you have to pick through a lot of other papers?
I think
That's
most of
kind
them are in the JST, but Brian, having done some hunting, outside of the JST, there's a couple documents that we're able to locate that I can think of, right?
yeah, we had one, I think it's maybe Harvey Wheelock. I need to check for sure, but basically he wrote down a Joseph Smith revelation that was given to him specifically, kind of calling him on a mission that was in his own journal that he wrote down at the time. And so we included that as well. And there's a couple, we kind of talk about the criteria for some of the revelations. We put a couple things in the appendix, which were more a little bit more contested, but which we felt we should say something on. And one of them is a reported revelation from 1831. And Stephen knows probably more about this, but W. Phelps wrote it down and later in his life in 1861. And so we know that a revelation was received based on contemporaneous sources, and the text that we have seems a little bit less trustworthy. So we put that in an appendix with some introduction to say, to highlight the contested nature of the revelation.
Yeah, I think most of the documents in our book are from the Joseph Smith papers. Of course, the Joseph Smith papers has been exhaustive in its ability in its research to uncover and publish Joseph Smith documents. So like a lot of the heavy lifting was done through the scholars associated with that project, which is wonderful for us. It removed a massive burden of having to scour through all sorts of different archives or repositories of textual material. But we did a little bit of scouring through the church history library, and other collections to make sure that we kind of caught most of what we can. Unfortunately, and as we say in introduction, this is not exhaustive. In fact, after we went to press, we uncovered at least a few other documents. We're like, oh, we maybe should have included that one too. But eventually you have to go to press and you have to get the book out there. You can only keep it in the works for so long. So, there is room for improvement and additional work on this subject. There are additional documents that we could have included if we had more time and more time to do more research. But most of it's from the Joseph Smith papers, and some of it are from some other collections that we were able to locate and scour through.
Can you give some examples of moments in early church history that these documents kind of fill in that a normal reader of the Doctrine and Covenants wouldn't really, that the Doctrine and Covenants doesn't fill in just by itself as much?
Sure. I can give one quick example, and probably one of the more interesting and in some ways one of the more fraught examples of this would be the origins of plural marriage and Joseph Smith's introduction of plural marriage in Nauvoo. So we have two revelations besides the William Phelps document that's in our appendix, which the context for that is essentially William Phelps produces this document, like Brian was saying, that purports to preserve a revelation as early as 1831, instructing Joseph Smith and other church elders to, quote, take wives of the Lamanites, end quote, right? So taking plural wives among indigenous American communities. That document is questionable in its provenance, but some of the documents that we don't believe are questionable, that are certainly Joseph Smith documents, include a blessing to Newell K. Whitney and his daughter Sarah Ann Whitney. Sarah Ann Whitney was sealed to Joseph Smith as a plural wife in 1842. And one of the documents in our book is the language of that sealing and that blessing to Newell K. Whitney and to Sarah Ann Whitney. So that's an important document that helps sort of flesh out the origins of Mormon plural marriage in the Nauvoo period. Another one is a revelation to Miranda Nancy Johnson Hyde, who was another plural wife of Joseph Smith. She was also the wife of Apostle Orson Hyde. And that one is not as overt as it being about plural marriage, but there is a reference in that revelation instructing Miranda to close effect, receive all instruction from my servant Joseph, which he shall give you, something to that effect. And in her own recollection about the origins and context of this revelation, she herself says, yeah, this was referring to the introduction of, quote, celestial marriage, right, in Nauvoo. So those are two documents that I think may jump out to a lot of readers as being especially significant to provide further sort of context to to the origins of plural marriage in early Mormon history. We don't have a lot of contemporaneous documents from Joseph Smith or others, obviously, pertaining to the origins of plural marriage. So any documents that we do have are very valuable. And these are two such documents that we have in our book. But Brian, what do you think? Do you have some others in mind?
Yeah, there's some other revelations. I think about the March 1832 revelation on the duties of the bishops, and it kind of shows how the revelation of what bishops were supposed to be doing was unfolding. And I've always been a little surprised actually that this didn't end up in the canon of scripture, but it kind of outlines the temporal duties of the bishop but reinforces the first presidency's ultimate authority in all the temporal affairs of the church. So it kind of shows how even really early on in the church, it's the bishops and the first presidency which are in charge of temporal duties. There's other things like a revelation to church leaders in 1834, which is a kind of a revelation of condemnation for leaders of the church for being lax with using their titles and things like that. And in the documentary record, you start to see when they talk about Joseph Smith, they write President Young, or they'll write Elder, or excuse me, President Smith, or they'll write Elder Young or Elder Kimball and things like that. And they start using official titles in the documentary record, and it's really kind of this is the revelation that really puts that into place. And so you could start to unravel what's going on in the historical record to see these changes occurring in real time.
Now, as you know, there's a division between Community of Christ and Latter-day Saints, like Doctrine and Covenants, where the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints puts in more of Joseph Smith's writings into their canon later.
Mhm.
Now, Brian, you told us that you did a whole thesis on the 1876 Latter-day Saint edition of the Doctrine and Covenants. Could you tell us a
Yeah.
little bit more about how that episode about how the canon got expanded with some of Joseph Smith's uncanonized revelations?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, in 1874, Brigham Young assigned Orson Pratt, who was one of the senior apostles at the time and the church historian, to review and revise the Doctrine and Covenants. And some of the preoccupations that he had, he wanted it more in chronological order. He wanted to see if he could get rid of some of the code names that were there originally in the Doctrine and Covenants that Joseph Smith had used. And he also, this was part of Orson Pratt's project to begin versifying everything as well. And so, as part of this big project, he was to look over the documentary record and see what other revelations would be useful for Latter-day Saints at the time. Now, one of the frustrating things is that we don't have Orson Pratt's notes saying, this is why I put in this revelation, this is why this one didn't make it, kind of thing. So, what I was able to do in my master's thesis was to kind of talk about what each of these revelations added or highlighted about the doctrine of the church, especially in the 1870s, and what he was able to do. So the things that he did do, he added 26 sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. Some of the more well-known ones for the Latter-day Saints based in Utah would be um, the uh, the dedication of the Kirtland Temple, and then later the vision that Joseph Smith records of Jesus Christ in the Kirtland Temple. He adds revelations that come, or actually teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith that come from the journals of William Clayton, which is really interesting, to try to kind of round out his teachings on marriage and the afterlife and that. And then he adds section 132, which is the revelation on celestial and plural marriage. In the 1870s, obviously this has resonance with members of Community of Christ at the time, or the reorganized church at the time, and their kind of ongoing uh, battle between whether plural marriage was something from Joseph Smith or not. And so him putting that revelation in there is kind of the Latter-day Saints saying, yes, we believe in this. This is a legitimate document, and this came from Joseph Smith. And yeah, so in total, he adds 26 sections of the Doctrine and Covenants. He also adds the first section of the Doctrine and Covenants that comes from a prophet other than Joseph Smith. He adds a Brigham Young revelation in there, and it kind of sets it up to be more of a canon where things will continually be added to it. Now, looking back in hindsight, we only have two other sections and then two official declarations that have been added since the 1870s. So it really was a radical change in the Doctrine and Covenants. But you can see kind of with what he adds, he's trying to shore up the doctrine of the church, highlight what he feels and what church leaders at the time felt were the most important teachings of the prophet Joseph Smith and of the church at large.
If I can just add quickly to that, I think Brian's
Sure.
done a great job contextualizing the 1876 Doctrine and Covenants. It may be worth pointing out as well that this question about what to canonize in the Doctrine and Covenants, which Joseph Smith documents do we elevate to the status, continued well into the 1920s. So the Latter-day Saints in Utah produced a significant new edition of the Doctrine and Covenants in 1921. This is where they dropped the Lectures on Faith from the canon. And today, the Lectures on Faith among Latter-day Saints in Utah, at least, kind of occupy this somewhat like liminal space of sort of like deuterocanon, if you will. I still see them cited and treated by some as if they were still in the canon, but they're not quite there. So they have this interesting position. But in that same edition of 1921, the Committee of Apostles, led by George F. Richards, others on the committee were Anthony W. Ivins, Joseph Fielding Smith, James E. Talmage, and Melvin J. Ballard. According to some notes that we have available from the committee, they were considering canonizing at least 20 other Joseph Smith revelations and some revelations from his successors in the church in Utah. So from John Taylor and Wilford Woodruff and so forth. I don't think we know much more about what those revelations were. Very little information has been made available on that, but it is interesting. We do have some sort of intriguing details, some breadcrumbs that there were these conversations going on as late as into the 1920s about which of these Joseph Smith documents to include. I like to kind of wonder in an alternate parallel universe or timeline where the committee does put these revelations in, what that would mean for the canon today and how that would kind of affect our understanding of the evolving canon. It's kind of a fun thought experiment. But from what we can tell right now, they were considering it, but of course they never did. Bruce R. McConkie, I can also say just quickly, in the 1970s with the committee that he was on with different apostles in Utah, they likewise had conversations about expanding the Pearl of Great Price with additional material from Joseph Smith, additional material from the Joseph Smith translation of the Bible, the Wentworth letter, the lectures on faith. So these sorts of documents have always occupied this kind of space where the sort of the prophetic custodians of the canon have considered whether to include them or not. And I think it raises very interesting questions about the process of canonization when we see these major editions come out and these sorts of questions are being wrestled with.
Now for my next question.
Mm-hmm.
What do we know about these uncanonized revelations they have in your book? What do we know about the reception, or were many of them published during his lifetime?
Good question. I guess I can just answer briefly again, and maybe Brian can help correct my many mistakes I'll make here. But basically, from what we can tell, most, if not all of these revelations, with few exceptions, were never published in Joseph Smith's lifetime. Many number of them were clearly meant for the individual that the revelation is directed to. So that's kind of an obvious reason why we can guess why it was never published or canonized. Certainly, the revelations to Newell K. Whitney and Sarah Ann Whitney was meant to be private. The revelation to Miranda Nancy Johnson, the revelations to the Council of 50. This is another, ecclesiastical and sort of political body, sort of straddles both of these spheres. Certainly, those revelations are meant to be private. So for a number of these revelations, they go uncanonized or unused or unpublished in Joseph Smith's lifetime, I think simply by virtue of they were meant to be private revelations. They weren't necessarily meant, at that time at least, for the church as a whole. Others, at least one or two, they were published, for example, in like church periodicals. So there's a revelation from 1838, I think it is, on sort of predicting the impending apocalypse and wars being poured out upon the nations and warning the Latter-day Saints to flee to Zion and to, hold up in their strongholds of Zion in Missouri. That was published, as I recall, in the Elders Journal, so the church's periodical at the time. But most of these revelations, as I said, were directed to individuals. Some of them are in Joseph Smith's manuscript Revelation book, his Revelation manuscript book from the Kirtland period, tucked in there with other revelations that do get published in the Doctrine and Covenants, but these ones don't. A few of them, if you look in the manuscript book, it has like a big X through it and it says do not publish, right? And we can only guess why that may have been. But so some of them, even they were aware this is a revelation, but we're not going to publish it. We can't know for sure. So in terms of their use and reception, probably they're just being used among the immediate recipients. It's always possible that details are being communicated word of mouth to family members or close associates of Joseph Smith. But as far as we can tell, the ones that were recorded and that have survived in the documentary record are not being widely used or disseminated during Joseph Smith's lifetime. Anything I need to correct? You need to correct there, Brian?
No, I think that's great. I know lots of Joseph Smith's revelations were published serially once the Saints got to Utah, and that's a lot what Orson Pratt relied on were the published accounts of the revelations in the Deseret News in kind of I think he called what ends up kind of becoming part of the history of the church is the life of Joseph Smith. And very few of these uncanonized revelations ever make it in there. Stephen's right. It's just, I think only very few ever make it in. And so, yeah, that's all I'll say about that.
Now, BYU's Religious Studies Center and Deseret Book, they seem to be having kind of deals for a while so they're like co-publishing things. So publishing it there kind of suggests you're hoping that an average Latter-day Saint would read these. What were you hoping they'd get out of these?
Yeah, that's exactly right. We were hoping to make this material accessible, and publishing through Deseret Book, right? It's a popular publisher of Latter-day Saint books. Most average Latter-day Saints have some Deseret Book titles on their bookshelf, most likely at home. And so this was a way to sort of, I don't want to say demystify this material, but maybe that's the word to use, but certainly to raise awareness that there is material outside of the Doctrine and Covenants, outside of the canon of the Latter-day Saints, that we feel is both instructive and interesting as historical documents, but also that are valuable as revelatory pronouncements from Joseph Smith. Now, we certainly do not presume that our book raises to the level of some kind of parallel canonical work with the standard works of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So our intention is certainly not to try to elevate ourselves or this work to that status, but merely to let Latter-day Saints be aware of this robust documentary record that, thanks to the Joseph Smith papers, is being made more accessible to your general readership of both Latter-day Saints and others. So on a very basic level, that was our decision to go with BYU's Religious Studies Center and with Deseret Book. It's in some ways, publishing with them also gives us a sort of, I guess I could say, imprimatur, right? That this material is quote unquote safe for mainstream Latter-day Saints, if you want to put it in those terms, right? And so that there hopefully will be no apprehension among average Latter-day Saints whether this material is worth pursuing or not. And so that was another kind of strategic thing we had in mind to go with this publisher.
Yeah, and I think the Papers Project is pretty amazing, and what they really wanted to do is encourage others to use the papers to create more scholarship. And it's really an invitation that Papers Projects do, is that they want to spurn other projects. And so we just wanted to make it really accessible for people. You had talked about earlier, had we kind of had to comb through the papers, and we did. They didn't just have one section of saying, here's all the revelations, right? It was, we looked through each of the years, and we were able to find the revelations, but there wasn't one location where people could find that. And so we wanted to draw upon the scholarship that Joseph Smith Papers had produced. Lots of other excellent scholars have worked on these revelations before. Stephen relied on some of it in like the Canadian copyright revelation, which is one of our first ones, and things have been written on them. And so we wanted to incorporate that into for people to approach in kind of an easy to use way. Now we do try to make it academic, but we also wanted to add some kind of devotional flair a little bit too, so of what you can take away from this revelation. What is this trying to teach, or how can you apply it in your life? So we have a little bit of that in there as well, while kind of more giving the introduction and the historical context and what this revelation means. But we also try to allow it to apply to people's lives as well.
Were there places where you're doing research where you wish there was more information?
Oh, certainly. Yeah. I think probably I can speak for both Brian and I when I say we certainly wish that we had more information about why these documents were not canonized. Right. So, as I mentioned, some of these revelations are in the manuscript book where the other revelations in the Doctrine and Covenants appear. And for whatever purpose, we just have indication from Joseph Smith and those compiling the manuscript revelation book that this is not to be published. They, in some cases, like I said, they physically put a big X in the manuscript through the text of the revelation. We are just kind of left to guess or infer why they may not have published that. We do have an account, speaking of the Canadian copyright revelation, we have a late kind of secondhand source claiming that Joseph Smith did not publish that, even though it's in the manuscript book, because he and David Whitmer basically got in an argument over whether or not it was a failed prophecy, right? And based on this account, Joseph Smith conceded to David Whitmer that it wouldn't be appropriate to publish this revelation since seemingly it did not come to pass. The validity of that account is perhaps questionable, but that does give us indication that there were discussions happening among early church leaders about whether to canonize revelations. Again, of course, famously, David Whitmer wasn't a fan of wanting to publish revelations, whereas Joseph Smith and Oliver Cowdery, they very much wanted to publish these texts. So it gives us indication that there were these discussions happening among church leadership. So I think probably that's the main thing I wish we had more information of. I can't. What do you think, Brian? Is there anything else that comes to mind? Would you say that's probably the main thing that we wish we had more info on?
Yeah, and some of the people mentioned in some of the revelations we don't have a lot of information on. One brother that I'm trying to remember his name off the top of my head, I can't, but he directs him through a revelation to be baptized. But he says, don't travel on the water when you go home, and wait till you get home to be baptized. And we don't
Are
actually
you talking about
know.
Erastus Holmes,
Yeah, the
perhaps?
Erastus Holmes. Yep, Erastus Holmes revelation. And we actually don't know if Erastus Holmes was ever baptized. We don't have any other documentary evidence about his life after that time period. So, trying to fill in some of these gaps and is difficult, and that's something that I wish we had more information about.
Now, when you were doing your research, was there a favorite uncanonized revelation either of you had?
Go ahead, Brian. You say yours
Yeah.
first, and I'll talk about mine.
Um, that's a great question. I think the revelation to Harvey Whitlock, I mentioned that earlier. I think I mentioned in the wrong context, but on November 16th, Harvey Wheelock kind of had been against Joseph Smith for a time and wrote to him for some forgiveness. And he wrote that Harvey Whitlock wrote the prophet Joseph Smith and said that he had fallen into an abyss and was racked with feelings of grief, lamentable sorrow, and anguish for his vice and folly. And he says, "Dear brother Joseph, let me entreat you on the reception of this letter, as you regard the salvation of my soul, to inquire at the hand of the Lord on my behalf." And it's a really beautiful revelation because it forgives him, right? It says, here's the text of the revelation: "Verily, thus saith the Lord unto you, let him who was my servant Harvey Whitlock return unto me and unto the bosom of my church, and forsake all the sins wherewith he has offended against me, and pursue from henceforth a virtuous and upright life, and remain under the direction of those whom I have appointed to be pillars and heads of my church. And behold, saith the Lord your God, his sins shall be blotted out from under heaven, and shall be forgotten from among men, and shall not come up in mine ears, nor be recorded as a memorial against him." And then the Lord kind of in this revelation says that he'll lift him up, and that he'll be, what does he say? A polished shaft in my quiver. And for me, it was inspirational because I feel like there are a lot of people who have made mistakes or and don't feel like, even after they felt some type of forgiveness, they don't feel like they can necessarily be useful to building up the kingdom of God or being helpful. And for me, it was a really beautiful revelation of total forgiveness, and you can still be used to bring about my purposes. And I really love that. So that's probably my favorite revelation that's not canonized.
Yeah, that's a good one and a top favorite of mine as well. But if I had to pick just one, I would pick the Canadian copyright revelation. So this is a really, really interesting document, and it's an early revelation to Joseph Smith. So best we can place it is early 1830. The context behind it is we get the story or the account from David Whitmer that after the Book of Mormon had been translated and it was with the printer, with the Grandin print shop in Palmyra, that Joseph Smith I think from Whitmer's account, at the behest of Hiram Smith or others, was eager to secure the copyright for the Book of Mormon in the British Empire. So they go up to Canada, and he sends four men. He sends, let's see here, Oliver Cowdery, Hiram Page, Josiah Stoll, and Joseph Knight Sr., sends them up to basically what is today outside of modern Toronto, Canada, where I happen to get my master's degree. So go Varsity Blues, University of Toronto. He sends them up there to secure the copyright for the Book of Mormon for it to be printed essentially in the British Empire, in the British provincial domain. They come back empty-handed without having secured a copyright or without having secured the rights to publish up there. And David Whitmer famously gives the account of Joseph Smith sort of shrugging his shoulders and saying, well, some revelations are from God, some are from man, or some are from the devil, right? And the way that David Whitmer tells the story, it makes it seem as though the whole endeavor was just like an abject failure, and that this quote unquote revelation that Joseph Smith pronounced wasn't a real revelation at all. Whitmer wants, of course, to create the impression that this was a failed revelation or it was not from a divine source. That was our main account we had for the longest time about this episode, was from David Whitmer. We did find a letter from Hiram Page, who's one of the participants in this episode. He gives a different account. It's in a letter to William McClellan. And essentially, the way Page tells the story is they go to Canada to secure the copyright. And when they fail to secure the copyright, the big takeaway they get from it is sometimes the Lord's servants are unable to accomplish his commandments he gives them, and that's really too bad. But he doesn't really question the validity of the revelation itself. Well, now we have the text of the revelation, which I think is very significant because, among other things, you can see that there's clearly this sort of conditional language in the revelation that if the people do not harden their hearts, and if my servants do not harden their hearts, then the Lord assures the the benefit or the outcome of this endeavor. So it's not quite as clear cut as David Whitmer makes it sound. There's clearly this conditional aspect that perhaps, as Hiram Page says, that they failed to meet. The other thing that's interesting about the revelation is it helps us clarify what exactly was Joseph Smith's intention behind, quote, selling a copyright. So at one point in the revelation, it says, I send you up there to, he says, be diligent in securing the copyright of my servant's work upon all the face of the earth. So the first step is to secure the copyright by going up to Canada and getting that. So they had a copyright in the United States. They get that in June of 1829 with the district clerk of New York, right? If they want to distribute the book in the British domain, in the British Empire, they have to go up and get one, a separate copyright. So the first part of the revelation is go and secure the copyright. Later, the revelation says, I grant unto my servant a privilege that he may sell a copyright. So legal scholars of copyright laws and intellectual property laws of the early 19th century, both the United States and Great Britain, they had pointed out there's a distinction between securing a copyright and selling a copyright. There has been misunderstanding in the past that Joseph Smith wanted to, quote, sell the copyright of the Book of Mormon, with the misunderstanding that this means he was somehow like relinquishing his rights to the book, or he was just trying to make money off of the book, or he was, I don't know, perhaps he was sort of giving up on the book already before it even got published. That's a misunderstanding. Basically, what he was doing, according to this language and the legal context of the time, this revelation is instructing Joseph Smith to essentially franchise the Book of Mormon, if you want to put it in that terms, to sell the right to a printer to copy it and publish it for him, right? So this isn't really a case of he's relinquishing his rights as the author and proprietor of the book, again, that legal language that appears in the 1830 Book of Mormon, but rather he is authorizing that Joseph Smith goes to Canada and finds a publisher who they will sell franchising rights to publish the book in the British Empire. So both broadly and with some of the minute details, it's important to have this document because it fleshes out this episode from early church history very nicely. And in addition to that, I think Latter-day Saints would resonate with the language of the Lord making a covenant with his servants, of promising to prosper them in their afflictions and in their difficulties according to their faith and their diligence, it says. So there's both sort of pastoral and spiritual significance in this revelation, as well as now having a much clearer picture based on the language of the revelation of what Joseph Smith and his associates were expecting to do, even though it ultimately isn't successful. I think it challenges David Whitmer's much later negative assessment of the episode by showing we don't need to necessarily jump to that conclusion the same way that David Whitmer did. So for those and other reasons, I think the Canadian copyright is my personal favorite one.
So now you've published this book, so what's next for both of you? Do you want to continue this research, or are you guys going somewhere else with your research, or what are you guys doing?
Great question, Catherine. Stephen and I are both PhD candidates. I just became one last month, finished my comprehensive exam, so I'm very happy about that. But I'm going to continue working on the concept of canon and the creation and kind of changes over time of the standard works for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and that's something that I plan on I'm doing for my dissertation. So kind of giving a canonical history of the standard works. So that's what I'm working on. I'm currently co-writing an article about an interesting canonical episode in the history of the church where two revelations given to John Taylor ended up in Swedish, Danish, and German editions of the book Doctrine and Covenants from 1888 all the way to, in the Swedish edition, existed up until the 1950s. And so they had an original section 137 and 138, which Latter-day Saints based in Utah would understand as different. So I was able to uncover some documents about, how did those end up in those specific language editions of the Doctrine and Covenants, who requested that, who gave authority for that, and when they were taken out. So hopefully I'll be publishing that article soon, and then I'll continue to expand on the creation of the canon over time.
Honestly, I'm kind of more interested in Brian's work than my own work, if I have to be honest. Like, I think that that sounds absolutely fascinating, history of the canon. I'm glad that we have somebody with very capable talent who will be able to properly study that. My dissertation is totally unrelated to anything with Latter-day Saint or Mormon history. In some ways, I'm kind of like an accidental Mormon historian guy with this kind of work. My formal academic training is in Near Eastern Studies and Egyptology. So, I mean, there is some crossover there, obviously, with the Latter-day Saint Book of Abraham, but not much overlap with the Joseph Smith's Revelations. So, as you said at the beginning, I just sort of stumbled on this topic in my own research, and Brian and I came together to work on it. So, outside of my non-Latter-day Saint academic work, such as my dissertation and other work that I'm oriented towards biblical studies and Egyptology, I do have some Latter-day Saint work on the horizon. Not so much to do with Latter-day Saint canon or the Doctrine and Covenants. I will mention, it's kind of funny, both Brian and I have had people come up to us and say, so what's next? The Uncanonized Revelations of Brigham Young or John Taylor, right? Like at a certain point, you sort of have to call it quits, right? Because there's such a vast body of documentary records that you could keep going forever, it seems like. So I'm not sure if we have any really plans at this time to go beyond the Joseph Smith revelations that we've compiled so far. Um, maybe down the road there's an article or two we could write discussing some of this, but I'm not sure if or when we'll ever compile, beyond Brigham Young, John Taylor, and so forth. My work in Latter-day Saint areas that I'm working on right now includes I'm working on a monograph exploring the origins and the history and the controversy surrounding the book View of the Hebrews, written by Ethan Smith, and its purported influence on Joseph Smith and the composition of the Book of Mormon. So this sort of gets to the heart of the controversy or discussion about the origins of the Book of Mormon and a potential environmental influence on Joseph Smith in the composing the Book of Mormon or translating the Book of Mormon. So my next big project is going to be addressing that. I've done quite a bit of interesting research on both Ethan Smith and View of the Hebrews, his book. For really quick sidebar for listeners who may not be familiar, I'm sure most of them have heard about it at least. View of the Hebrews is this book written by a reverend named Ethan Smith, no relation to Joseph Smith, in the early 1820s, essentially arguing for the Native Americans being descendants from the lost tribes of Israel. Some have pointed to this as a potential environmental source on Joseph Smith's thinking or on the composition of the Book of Mormon. This is a controversy that has a history of well over 100 years now, where people have been arguing and debating this and looking into this. So I'm working on I've already published an article or two on it, and now I'm working on a book-length manuscript, picking apart the history of this controversy, the origins of it, and what we can learn from that. And so kind of, it's like a history of a book about a book kind of thing, sort of a reception history type of thing, and a history of polemics or history of debate or controversy, that kind of thing. So that's probably my next big thing from a Latter-day Saint perspective I hope to tackle.
Now, if people want to get in touch with you both, where can they find you?
Well, I'm
Yeah,
not
go ahead.
super active on social media these days. I do have a podcast I'm a co-host of. The podcast is called Informed Saints. And so you could probably reach out through our social media channels there to talk with me more. I do have a personal Facebook page, right? So you could also DM me on Facebook, I suppose. And so that's probably the best way to get a hold of me, is to just sort of find me on Facebook or through Informed Saints. Brian is way more popular than me, so he probably has all sorts of places you could find him, right?
Yeah, on TikTok now.
Yeah.
One of the best places to contact me is actually through the Church History Library's Ask Us system, because as a research consultant at the Church History Library, if you go on the Church History catalog and you have a question, you can click on this Ask Us button on the catalog, and you could just say "Attention, Brian Passantino," and I would get that. So my team and I go over those requests every single day. That's a great way to get a hold of me. I also have a Facebook page and LinkedIn and any way for people to contact me. So those are kind of the principal ways for sure.
Let me just say right now for any listeners, all of your really hard questions, please direct to Brian. He's much better equipped to handle those than I am. No, but in all seriousness, I just want to compliment my co-author and friend here. Brian and others of the Church History Library do a really great job responding to inquiries about the archives or church history questions. And if you reach out to Brian, he and I are fast friends, and so he can also forward anything to me as well. And so probably then the best way to contact me is to contact Brian, I suppose is what I'm saying here. So in either case, direct all inquiries towards Brian Passantino.
Yeah, great.
You've both been very gracious with your time. So thank you for joining us today.
Thank you
Any
so much,
any
Catherine.
last words
Yeah.
before we go?
No, thank you so much for having us on. We hope that our book will be of interest and value both to general readers who have an interest in Latter-day Saint or Mormon history, whichever branch of the Restoration you happen to align with, whichever tradition of the Restoration you are a part of. We think that these documents should have common interest across denominational lines, since we all, in some way or another, right, go back to Joseph Smith. So hopefully this should be of interest to a general readership, but also scholars. We hope that this will be accessible and interesting to scholars of Joseph Smith, those who want to know more about the early Latter-day Saint canon for Brian's work, or early Joseph Smith documents, and to see some of the great work that can come from the Joseph Smith papers, and the great benefit that this work has been to Joseph Smith papers for furthering scholarship. So hopefully our book is useful to both general readers and to scholars.
Yeah, we thank you so much, Catherine, and we wish you best of luck in your continued studies as well.
All right, thank you.
We want to thank you for tuning in to the Whitmercast. John Whitmer Historical Association is an educational nonprofit institution. For more information, visit www.jwha.info, where you can meet our team and join the association, read past issues of the JWHA Journal, and get updates on upcoming conferences and events. Our theme music is I Love to Tell the Story, composed by Tom Moraine. This podcast is a production of John Whitmer Historical Association, all rights reserved.